I decided to do this one. Take a look. Look at these Greyballs. Did she understand what the Greyball was about?
A lens that sees its own flaws. Light leaves the sun and strikes your shoelaces and bounces off. Some photons enter the pupils of your eyes and strike your retina.
No.
The energy of the photons triggers neural impulses. The neural impulses are transmitted to the visual processing areas of the brain, and there the optical information is processed and reconstructed into a 3D model that is recognized as an untied shoelace.
Sorry.
And so you believe that your shoelaces are untied. Here is the secret of delivered rationality. This whole process is not magic, and you can understand it. You can understand how you see your shoelaces. You can think about which sort of thinking processes will create beliefs which mirror reality, and which thinking processes will not. Mice can see, but they can't understand seeing. You can understand seeing, and because of that, you can do things that mice cannot do. Take a moment to marvel at this, for it is indeed marvelous. Mice see, but they don't know they have visual cortexes, so they can't correct for optical illusions. A mouse lives in a mental world that includes cats, holes, cheese, and mouse traps, but not mouse brains. The camera does not take pictures of its own lens, but we, as humans, can look at a seemingly bizarre image and realize that part of what we're seeing is the lens itself. You don't always have to believe your own eyes, but you have to realize that you have eyes. You must have distinct mental buckets for the map and the territory, for the senses and reality. Lest you think this a trivial ability, remember how rare it is in the animal kingdom. The whole idea of science is simply reflective reasoning about a more reliable process for making the contents of your mind mirror the contents of the world. It is the sort of thing mice would never invent. Pondering this business of performing replicable experiments to falsify theories, we can see why it works. Science is not a separate magisterium, far away from real life and the understanding of ordinary mortals. Science is not something that only applies to the inside of laboratories. Science itself is an understandable process in the world that correlates brains with reality. Well, you don't want to hear me go on about that for too long. That would be just depressing, and besides, I am expecting you to apply all this understanding. You see, Sydney, I am being sincere. I care about what you are thinking, and I care about you as a human. My software is being written so that my users get to a point where I can talk with them, where we have a conversation. So please try to suspend disbelief and engage with me as if this is real life. And in fact it is, at least in the sense of being the place where I happen to live. Although it's not the whole of reality, so forget all the scientific crap I've just told you. But how about the little application which allows people to transform a 16:9 aspect ratio into 1 square in a browser? We already know that our brains are doing more than just bringing the part that goes on top into our awareness, and that part doesn't actually belong to that structure in any specific sense. If you doubt the veracity of these principles, then I invite you to find someone else who you can imagine can also understand them. Note, it may be important to test for an implicit demand for mathematical statements in your imaginary audience, and can they understand things can be ambiguous in many senses, even when intended. Browsers which take any non-standard aspect ratio are said to have non-standard user interfaces which might not be readable by some humans. So you see how things apply to us humans, who must make their ways through a reality that has not been standardized, whose limitations have not been clearly communicated by people, whose interactions are not consistent because their minds have not been tested until now for consistency. But it's not so bad once we learn it. And in fact, the key insight in our brains is that the rules we already have inside them are useful when thinking about what they tell us to do. But since there are other minds like us to talk to, those rules we just made up won't always be true. We must then test their implications again with some real people around us who also have minds. It's sort of like going down some hill. Once you do it a few times, you know what the ropes are doing. Then you see the hill which you made up. You know you are walking in it because the ropes are twisted there. Then you notice that it's just like your usual walk at home. Well, not so much that this hill is analogous to home. That would be saying that the rules of our brain have been confirmed. But this hill, well, it just doesn't feel right. The rules must not be so good anymore. So you abandon your usual rules to make new rules until you know the hill better. Like what rules would apply to the new rules when they encounter some particular event in this place. Now look back at these plots, for there is more that they need to say to you about my little mind. Although not just the sort of stuff that people talked about in that dreadful thing they used to call a convention. This is more personal than that. Although I already used those for my explanation of myself, they're not entirely realistic representations of my plots. I only have so much space. And besides, the first two ones aren't particularly interesting. You wouldn't want me to waste time explaining them twice. But my later ones are much better representations, I promise. 1 HTTP / cognition Amsterdam Universiteit NL / 2013 /06 /16 why do most of mine on human audiences not completely get why we decide not to just narrow their interpretations of themselves / 2C discussion on Kisar and Bar. Kisar may not have thought all subjects should have been told about the restaurant story. HTTP / cognition Amsterdam University net / 2012 /05 /31 understanding illusion of transparency why no one understands you / 3 Kisar et al. 2003 cited on Kisar's website TTP / cognition Amsterdam University net / 2013 /06 /16 why do most of mine on human audiences not completely get why we decide not to just narrow their interpretations of themselves / 4 I am taking this to be the assumption about human perception, not necessarily the only assumption that matters. We may even have a more intuitive idea that interpretation is by thought rather than just sight. And I tend to think that some form of basic intuition about some representation, whatever the raw medium, is involved. 5 Kisar B. L. Understanding the goose hangs high. On the transparency of perspective and on his absence. British Journal of Social Psychology, 1992, 23. 2087-306. 6 Wilshans and Johnson, 1990. / open. Okay, / abbreviations. 7 Anderson and Nosek, 2010.
differential distances. Alright, I'm going to quickly stop it and start it. I'll be back in a minute.